I'm just delighted to be welcoming this lunch panel. And as I welcome them, feel free to just come on up. We've had such an exciting morning talking about all kinds of new innovations highlighted in the 21 chapters. We've had trailblazers from Texas, from Philadelphia, from New Jersey, from our partners at Google and the Renew Fund at Central Health, asking really important questions around, in the workforce system, who pays, who benefits, and who shares the risk when we don't achieve outcomes. So for our lunch conversation, we're going to broaden the conversation a little bit and have just three extraordinary thought leaders to talk more broadly about the future of work, the state of economic mobility in America. And we have three amazing people. All the way to the left is Margaret Spellings. Margaret is the CEO of the Bipartisan Policy Center and the former Secretary of Education. Next to Margaret is Cecilia Rouse, my friend, who is the CEO of the Brookings Institution and the former chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. And then we have the extraordinary moderator in Eduardo Porter of the Washington Post, who is a prolific writer on these topics and who's also the author of American Poison and the Price of Everything. So I'll leave it to you, Eduardo, for an exciting conversation over lunch.
Thank you so much. Thank you guys for being here. Thank you, Cece. Thank you, Margaret. I was going to start this with some questions about the direction of the labor market, but I thought that given the recent news and given the audience, I should start with something a little bit more timely, more newsworthy. What's going on with the dismantling of the education department? And how's that going to affect workforce development?
We're coming in hot. Well, I get asked this a lot, and of course, with each passing day, there's a little more happening, but I try to be a very polite Bush Republican and say, you know, I just have a lot of questions. And the first question is, you know, what the hell? But usually it's spicier than that even. But seriously, how are we going to get the work done that the Congress has asked this agency, this department to do? Can we get Pell Grants to the many millions of borrowers in an efficient and timely way here as we enter a new school year? Can we do a vigorous civil rights enforcement agenda as is required by law? What's happening with the title programs? Are the states going to get the money? And what if they don't? And just all the trickle-down effects. And you know, I do believe that the chickens will come home to roost and there will be real impacts of these things. But so far, you know, the sun has set in the west. I think one of the things that's really happening, and it is part of our policy discussion today, and obviously there's a lot of good innovation going on around the country, is we're seeing a recalibration of the federal role versus the state role versus cities and the private sector and local governments, et cetera, et cetera. And that's a good and worthy conversation. And so what are the things we care about? What are our objectives? I mean, you won't be surprised to know that one of the things I'm most terrified about, and it's frankly very small money in the giant scheme of things, is the assault on the data and research piece of the Department of Education. So, hi, Tina. Anyway, if we don't have information, if we don't have the data, and we don't have a problem, we don't need to resource a problem, and, you know, you get it.
Yeah. So I guess the question that flows from that is, who should be doing workforce development work? What is the role, as you point out, of the federal government, state, local governments, and critically of the private sector? From my perhaps naive perspective, the private sector is probably the best place, the best entity to be doing it because it brings the training very close to actual jobs. And yet, you know, private employers left to their own devices will probably underprovide training because they fear that if they train people, these people might leave to another employer and it's a lost money. So what should the strategy be? Is it like providing more subsidies for private investment in training, federal, state subsidies, or what's the direct role of the state, Department of Education, Department of Labor, state, local?
Well, first, if you're talking to me, we ought to have a strategy, and that is what we do not have right now. In fact, we at the BPC have created this Commission on the American Workforce. I commend it to you. Deval Patrick, the former governor of Massachusetts, and Bill Haslam, of Tennessee are the two leaders of it, but it's got a lot of state folks on it in a very bipartisan way, and articulate our strategy for the American workforce, because we just don't have that as a country. What are we trying to do, for whom, when, at what cost? What is the role of the private sector, the public sector, and so forth? So we don't know. And right now, one thing we're for sure of is that it doesn't work well at all. And Cece is going to talk about, as the blue chip economist that she is, kind of the implications broadly. But I can tell you what I've seen at a state level, at a university level, at a community college level, that it's random acts of kindness. And so that's why we have random outcomes and a lack of clarity about what we're trying to do. So let's get a strategy, and then I think the answer is, I disagree with you, Eduardo. We just met, and I don't want to get off to a bad start, but
Go for it.
But this idea that the private sector is very cheap on training, no, they've evolved beyond that. They know that stackable credentials that might help your competitor in the short run also inure to your benefit over time as well. So everybody ought to be doing workforce development, but we ought to have in mind, what are we trying to do, who's responsible, who's paying for it, and what's the accountability, and how will we know we're getting there? And we don't have that.
I forgive you for so this leads to the next question, the what for, what are we training for, what's the labor market that we're looking at when we think of training? And I've done some writing looking at the evolution of quality and quantity of jobs over the past few decades, and one of the trends that I've seen, that you've detected, is this kind of like lowering the emergence of a large number of fairly low quality jobs in the service industry of quite low pay. And so there's no problem of job quantity, but there does seem to be a problem of job quality across the economy. The rise of the 7-Eleven labor force is like a big source of job growth. And so I wonder, is there a way, what's the best strategy to improve workplace outcomes, to improve worker outcomes? And is there a role for worker development and training in that? Or is this just a question of, labor, that's the labor demand that we've got, and so it's not really a role for training?
Cece, that sounds like
I actually don't fully understand the question, because as you kind of alluded to towards the end, the wages that go along with a job, the compensation, reflect a whole host of things, and not just the, part of it is the skills that are embodied in the workers that are doing them, but it also reflects, other aspects of the labor market. I guess the way that I would rephrase that is, I was going to take slight issue, which you did not quite give me a chance to do. I don't think that all job training is bad.
No,
I think it is true that it's been somewhat scattershot. I think we definitely have some examples of job training programs that do make a demonstrable difference. But part of the challenge is you get what you pay for. And so you have short-term training. You get the people. You may even say that that's cost beneficial. Like it may, if the training isn't very long, it's not very expensive, it may increase people's wages by a little bit. It's not going to completely change their lives. It's not going to move them out of poverty. It may move the needle. So it still may make sense from a policy perspective, but it's not going to be the pillar on which we build the middle class, et cetera. But we have examples. At the same time, what I would agree with you, Margaret, is that we don't have a strategy. So some of the better job training programs, for example, are sectoral-based training programs. And so that's where you have the employers coming together, working with the training providers. Often a union is involved so that you solve some of the challenge of workers get trained and then they go off and work for somebody else, because what we've trained as workers for a particular area or in a particular sector. And those tend to be in more higher paid jobs and in higher paid kinds of occupations, such as nursing, that do require more training. The second part of your question, though, is about sort of we are a service economy. And we have pivoted to being a service economy. And one of the reckonings we have in this country is that care is not very highly paid. We see that on the preschool side. We see that on the elder care side. And yet we know that the best outcomes for children are with more highly paid childcare workers. But there's a real problem in that labor market, right? These are parents who are shelling out the money typically to pay for the care providers, they don't have the income to pay for the kind of quality that they need. It requires some public investment, but that's not the tradition in the United States. Higher income families can afford the better quality care. Their children then get the benefit of that. So you have in lower income families. Okay, getting kind of personal here. Yesterday I was in a Lyft with a driver who's a single mom and who was saying, I want to work I'll work all day, but I need someone to take care of my kid. So you have this care problem. And then on the older side, you have another challenge. And so what have we relied on? 25% of that workforce is immigrants.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so we are dealing with that in a different way.
Yeah.
But so, I don't know like the economics of how do we increase the pay and the compensation so we have highly qualified people who are doing that work and who want to do that work. The Biden administration went about it in one way. I'm not going to say that that's the way it needs to be done. But we need qualified workers who are trained to do that care. I will just note that in Japan, they tried to substitute capital for labor on the higher end, right? They tried to bring in robots to help in nursing homes, and actually it ended up hiring more people because it turns out the robots can't do all the things that you actually need for taking care of people.
Yeah. And Japan has this extra constraint that it doesn't really like migrants that much, and its population is shrinking.
Yep.
So
Right.
it's got a labor force problem there.
Yeah. So
But here on the elder side of the scenario that you just pointed out, I mean, the payer, I think the biggest payer is in fact Medicaid. So and Medicaid doesn't pay very well either.
Right.
And so that's sort of kind of like the question that maybe it has a very simple, stupid solution, but that I still grapple with how does training and workforce development, which is what you all do, fit into to solve this conundrum? It seems to me that maybe, but that's not where the problem is. The problem is in the money at the end of the day, the wage.
So a couple of thoughts. We have, all these siloed kind of ideas. WIOA and local workforce boards, and I hope I'm not going to hurt anybody's feelings. I probably will. But they do some of the stuff that Cece's talking about. Let's get you a resume. Let's get you a ride to the thing. And, I have, and you have too, Peter, been to things where, yay, Susie, 5 people got jobs at Wendy's. And it is short-term triage kind of stuff. Not that there's anything horribly wrong with that, but that is not a pathway or anything akin to it. Okay, so that's there. And furthermore, and not to be personal about this Department of Labor, Department of Education thing, consistently, OMB, from every administration I'm familiar with, has looked at the Department of Labor's effectiveness on those programs as part of their review, and they always get a big thumbs down, a big negative emoji. And frankly, the things that are going on at the Department of Education have tended to work better. So let's move all of that over to the Department of Labor.
No, we just did that opposite.
Yeah, right. So anyway, there's that bucket of kind of short-term things. Then, of course, in post-secondary education in our technical schools, and I commend the Texas State Technical College example in the book today, but we've just, in Texas, reinvented the community college funding system to be more performance, more labor market oriented. That's a real good thing to do. But a lot of that training and educating and credentialing obviously happens in our public post-secondary institutions, community colleges and universities. And you see more of that happening, and that's great. I'm more familiar with Texas, so I'll use these examples, but UT has partnered with the tech companies to embed those skills into four-year degrees and vice versa. And so there's just a better feedback loop that's happening out on the ground, which is fantastic. But what we still lack is a federal approach that can sort of aid and abet that as opposed to be a hindrance. And that's what worries me about some of the discussion we're having up here right now, is it's such a jump ball. People in the real world are trying to figure out what the heck is going on up there. Can I rely on this funding or not? And so on. So it's really kind of setting us back because it's such a huge distraction.
I completely agree about the distraction. Can I just take possibly the lemonade side of it?
Sure.
If we wanted to embrace this and it was more thoughtful, there has always been this great divide between the Department of Labor and Department of Education. And as Margaret just spelled out, a lot of that training is actually happening in educational institutions, but Pell Grants are administered Department of Education. the training dollars are in Department of Labor, even though someone might take a WIOA grant, sit in the same classroom as somebody with a Bell Grant, and they're getting the same training, but one is called training and one is called a community college education. And for this was very much highlighted during the Great Recession when we really had a lack of demand for labor. Workers couldn't get a job, so a lot of people wanted to take the opportunity to get trained. And the division in how these federal, you guys know this better than I do, I'm sure, the way you see the federal funding work, there's a great divide. You can't switch from one to the other.
Right.
And it's not just one stop, just like what's the best program for me to get the skills that I need in order to get the jobs that are available in my neighborhood. So some of the creative folks are trying to find ways to put it together. But this could be an opportunity to rethink what is the federal role in educating adults, shall we say.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And so that, as we sort of rethink the Department of Education. But that to me feels like what's most essential, as opposed to literally which funding stream is it coming from.
This is a question that I've long had. As you pointed out a moment ago, the U.S. is by now a service economy. We seem to be still very much in love with manufacturing. At least, the past few administrations have put a lot of policy emphasis on growing manufacturing employment. And I wonder how that feeds through, or whether that feeds through into the worker development and training part of it. I don't see enormous success on the increasing manufacturing employment, although it has grown in recent years. It's still pretty way lower than it was even 20 years ago. Is this might distorting policy in a way? Or how is workforce development different from if you understand that we're in a service economy versus the seeming to me nostalgic view that we need to reinvigorate the manufacturing labor force?
I think that's for you.
Thanks.
Make American manufacturing.
Yeah, exactly. Look, there's a reason why we don't have manufacturing at the levels we did at one time. Does it make sense for us to do more manufacturing in the United States, especially in some critical areas? I would say yes. I would argue yes.
Right.
And
that's why we had a bipartisan bill.
Exactly, right? So I think that makes some sense. It is very capital intensive at this point. And so it is not going to be the employment engine for mass numbers of people. It will be very good jobs for people who get those jobs and who are trained to do those jobs. And I think there's still a role for people to be trained to do those jobs, because as I understand it, some TSMC brings in workers from Taiwan who are skilled enough to do that work. So there's clearly a role for us to train U.S. workers to do some of that work. I'm just exaggerating, the 6 people who get the jobs. So that is not going to be the way. That is not, if one were to project out where the jobs are coming from in numbers, it is not going to be from manufacturing, even as manufacturing, I think, has an appropriate role in our economy. The bigger challenge is, as we think about artificial intelligence and other kinds of emerging technology, how are workers going to be interacting? And I'm looking at Zav. Greg's my colleague at Brookings. I don't know if you spoke to this earlier, but we've been doing some thinking about that and trying to understand and try to get ahead. At least what we can see now is the LLM version, the large language models. That's not the end of the road here on where our technological advances will go. And so really understanding how you make all of that technology complementary with workers. How do you train workers to be working with it? It will likely displace some. We don't really know who. It's not going to be the same as with the original technological revolutions in the 80s. It's going to push down on the cognitive scales. But I don't think it's going to fully replace people. Then the question is going to be, how are we working with it? And anyway, this is a longer conversation. Yeah. But I think that is the bigger challenge than how do we really train the few people who are going to be working in advanced manufacturing plants.
I agree with that. I want to add one thing, though. When we look at who's unemployed or underemployed in our country, we are doing a pitiful job of getting people in our K-12 schools and otherwise the basic skills, basic literacy and numeracy to do anything. And so, that's, I think, gets overlooked as part of a raging fire. The person who is illiterate is not going to be showing up for the 6 jobs. Yeah. And that is actually what, to me, the federal role has been about. A leveling of the playing field, a civil rights agenda and, a more opportunity agenda across the country. And so I hope that will not be lost on the cutting room floor, because it's very much, foundational and fundamental to these other conversations.
I completely, in fact, in some work that I did, this is a while ago, but I suspect is still true, on adult literacy and training, a lot of it is just literacy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So a lot of what we think of as training is teaching basic reading and writing. And so I think Margaret's absolutely right. That can't be lost, and that is where that's our biggest challenge. Even understanding showing up for work on time.
Yeah. And so these are the people who are in elder care.
Yeah. Yeah.
And early childhood care.
Yeah. And by that, how far up the education ladder do you think the effort should go? I mean, an argument that's become kind of popular in recent years is that the U.S. produces too many liberal arts majors in colleges and too few plumbers and electricians, and so that the educational kind of like education is skewed in the wrong way somewhat to fit the needs of the economy and the labor market. I'm not very partial to that thought, but I believe it's quite popular, and I wonder whether there is there might be a good argument to reframe or tweak the type of education that is provided beyond basic literacy.
So it's both and, right? We see the unemployment rate for college educated workers is still half that of people without a college degree. So it's not that we still don't see evidence that we're producing too many. But at the same time, we know that especially some of the people who Margaret was just speaking about, are just out of the labor force altogether. So we're not even measuring them when we think of an unemployment rate. And we do need plumbers and electricians and people who do some of those basic services. And we do know the evidence on career technical education really can lead to higher employment. So this is both and. I think we need a stronger system all the way through. Because we have a complex economy that has many different jobs.
But one thing I think is really changing in the higher ed landscape is that brand is mattering less and less. How attractive is Harvard or Columbia or whatever, et cetera. And price is mattering more. And evidencing skills, knowledge, ability on day one is mattering more and more. And so how is it that people are going to, capture that beyond just, here's my diploma? And because that clearly is inadequate. So that's a vista in this that I'm really excited about is, how will employers know I'm ready to add value here?
So now to jump to the technological question that you just raised a moment ago, that is, I agree, the most important one going forward. And of course, AI is a big looming threat or opportunity, I guess, depending on where you're sitting. But to not let you guys off the hook, so how do we help workers prepare for AI-heavy future, at least from what we can see from AI so far? Are we making the right investments long-term? Thinking through proper strategies in terms of how to prepare the workforce for this new world?
I mean, I think there's a lot more than we don't know than we know. And so I think, what should we do that we know for sure? Well, we better teach people to read and to have basic numerical skills, how to show up, how to work together in a team, so those are the things we know for sure. So and we're not doing that very well, so let's, get about it. And then, I think we're going to have to adapt and evolve. I don't know, I hope maybe you have the answer to all of this, but who knows? We have no idea how AI is going to change for the good and for the ill. We hear the horror stories from Anthropic and whatnot, that no one with a baccalaureate degree is ever going to be able to get a job. Sorry, Mom.
Well, they have an incentive to say that.
True enough.
So some of our colleagues at Brookings have really been thinking about this and looking at like the Screenwriters Guild and then and arguing for workers being more engaged in helping be more involved in how their companies are engaging and employing and using AI. I think the reality is that there are a lot of earlier career folks who are using AI more than their bosses may understand. Yeah. And so I suspect that it is already more prevalent in our workplaces than any survey data would suggest. I think that's certainly true at my institution. likely yours.
I'm pretty sure that's
So I think that this is moving so quickly.
Yeah.
And I think it behooves us to learn to work with it and to do it in a way that complements workers. I do think in the bit that I've worked with it and seen it in use, beware the companies that think it will replace their workers. I think over-reliance on it is going to lead to a lot of mediocrity and a lot of mistakes that are going to be hard to recover from. Yeah. So I think it's a tool. I think it's an exciting tool. But the idea that it wholesale replaces, there's no judgment that's employed.
Yeah.
That, there's data that suggests it doesn't think of new things. It is phenomenal at summarizing what is on the internet. And clearly it's evolving, but it's not creative. It's not coming up with the new thing. And it can't fact check itself. And, the writing is kind of bland. So if you over-rely on it, it's not going to actually help companies truly innovate and get to the next level. So.
Yeah. No, I was thinking about, there's this book by Daron Acemoglu and Simon Johnson that speaks to how technology could be used in a complementary fashion to workers' existing skills. And maybe there is a good opportunity there, because if AI can provide the expertise in some specific narrow that the worker doesn't already have, it can maybe help turn, I don't know, a nurse into a doctor or something along that path by providing some sort of something that the worker is not quite trained in, and that would actually presumably reduce inequality in the labor market and increase outcomes at the very bottom.
I'm not sure I'm going to think that the angels will completely sing like that, but I think there's no question it has a way. There's a way for it really to be used to its strength, which is to have the facts and to be able to assemble those facts pretty quickly. Although you still need somebody who's making the judgment, which fact did it actually come back with that when there's a conflict, when there are conflicting facts.
Yeah.
So you still need someone who's there providing some judgment.
So this is a good time for me to do an infomercial on federal research. And the need for that, the need for gathering data, collecting data, and the need for us to know these things for the good of the world, for the good of the private sector and policymaking and whatnot. And so that used to happen and is still happening, obviously, but it's not an inconsequential matter to invest in these things that are the big, hairy, thorny questions that we look to our higher ed institutions to help discover.
Although you got to remember, if you don't test for COVID, you don't have COVID, right?
Well, I said something like that a bit ago. Yeah.
So sticking to the theme of technological development, we do have some experience, not with AI, but with the arrival of information technology and the increasing automation that happened across many industries, and the effect that had on the labor market. There was a ton of job displacement, and lots of work was replaced by robots. And I wonder, does that period teach us anything about how to confront this current technological revolution? Because it doesn't seem to me that we did it particularly well, over the last 20, 30 years. Are there mistakes that we should avoid? Or
I'm sure there are many, many, many lessons we could learn. The one that I think sticks with me, and this is technology and globalization, so it's all kind of a one, is that especially as much as I believe that we should be trying to develop these technologies to be complementary with labor, some of it will be replacing labor. And I think that and it's in the name of efficiency, and efficiency means that the pie is getting bigger so that we all can gain. And I believe that we have all benefited from some of the technological advances in the 80s and even increased globalization. And so the benefits have been widely shared. But what we underappreciated was that the costs were very concentrated. And I think if I were to say one lesson is that as we're displacing workers, I don't think it's enough to say we should provide universal basic income and people should just go home and just have a leisure their whole day. Because I think fundamentally people need some structure in their lives. They need purpose in their lives. They want to be doing something with their day that brings them dignity. And I think it's important that we retain that. We have to retain our communities. I think this is part of the increasing polarization in this country. I think this is part of the deaths of despair that my colleagues Angus Deaton and Ann Case have written about, and that the dropping out of the labor force. I think people need to have that kind of activity. And so that's what scares me the most, is thinking that we can replace people with technology and not have social consequences. Because as much as we love a vacation, as much as we want to have some leisure in our day, in our week, or in our lives, we need that. We also need to have a purpose. And so that is the part of this that does give me a little bit of angst.
And we need to pay the bills also.
And we need to pay the bills.
Yeah.
Or I do anyway.
Well, the very wealthy will pay the income.
Right. That's
Yeah.
your program.
Yeah, they don't share. That's the other problem.
Just to press the point one further bit, is there a role for the government to help steer decisions on capital investments in these sorts of technologies? So I have heard arguments in that the taxation of labor and capital could be rejiggered in a way that provided less incentives to replace labor. I mean, I know this is not a training and development question, but it seems an important labor force question.
Yeah. You should answer
I think
that.
there's lighter touches than industrial policy, and I'm not a tax policy expert, but I think that's right. Some people have proposed, because right now we subsidize the investments in capital over labor for a variety of reasons that my tribe has advocated for, and one could look at that and try to provide more of an incentive to be encouraging hiring labor. It's not as efficient is part of the challenge, as we really have striven for maximum efficiency. I think we've lost some remembering that we have efficiency, we have equity, we have making sure that that it is shared, and I'm not. That is, that maybe we want to give up a couple of equity efficiency points for a little bit more equity, just have people, again, having something to do with their lives. But, fundamentally, I think that this is part of the challenge. Right now, we have decision makers who are trying not to get in the way of the train of developing technology, because there's a great fear of falling behind internationally, competitively in the development of advanced technology, which could have national security consequences, let's be real. And so we don't want to fall behind there, and yet we have not developed a framework for even developing the rules of the road that might help not only generate some of the worst outcomes in terms of national defense and all the other things. I have a team that's working on who makes the final decision if there's nuclear war with China, right? Fortunately, she and President Biden agreed that should be a person, so let's agree with that. But other rules of the road that could be built in, this is part of Daron Acemoglu's and Simon Johnson's point, is we could build in that companies need to develop these technologies in ways that complement workers and not just substitute. But that's not how we govern in this country, at least not today.
And back to the workforce conversation. I mean, so here, this is all happening. And here we are in this room, building earn and learn and apprenticeship programs with the person and a thing and for a job that's very likely to be replaced.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
we can't be solving yesterday's problem over here. And so how should we think about that? Again, that's, I think demands a research agenda, which did inform and did, net learnings from the previous technological investments and all across the government. So anyway, lots to think about and lots of levers to pull on. So now governors and states are ascendant in this, and tax credits, and it's all a big stew, and why we need, a more coherent strategy, which is just random acts of kindness so far.
So I'll throw in a quick last question before I open it up for the audience to ask questions. It's a generational question. You mentioned the cohort of deaths of despair and so on. So mainly older workers, or mid-career, late-career workers that suddenly found themselves jobless and fell into despair. But it seems to me that right now the cohort that's having particular trouble is much younger. I've got a kid in college coming out next year and freaking out over what the job market's going to look like for him. And I wonder whether this calls for, a different, what this would imply in terms of how to prepare the future labor force. We've got a problem with the kids that, this future of upward mobility that this country's supposed to be about now looks actually maybe not so solid. What do we need to do to improve their career prospects?
I mean, yeah, that's a tough one because it is such a, I mean, honestly, I think the biggest, you may disagree, issue is not what's happening with AI and that might paralyze. I mean, I think other uncertainty in the economy and in the tariffs and the this, that, and the other thing is more disruptive in the short run for somebody who's, a soon-to-be college grad. And so we got to get that settled down and free the capital that's in the private sector that can and will create jobs. Get some certainty in the public sector, and then I think time will roll on. But it's not AI that's going to locate this job. I mean, people are paralyzed just because what the hell? What happened yesterday? What happened today? What's going to happen tomorrow? I don't know. We're not going to have a federal government at all.
Maybe not. Yeah.
I think she's absolutely right. You can actually see it in the data. If you look at the unemployment rate for young people who are just getting out of college compared to high school graduates compared to older cohorts, it has been trending upwards, but steadily so even before the introduction of ChatGPT and AI. So I think Margaret's absolutely right that there are many more uncertainties in this society, in this economy right now that are likely affecting the labor market for our young people.
Yeah, thanks.